critics might say this was a win for Russia and China, and to not secure an outright condemnation of Russia's invasion is a failure for President Joe Biden and the Western bloc he leads, who are spending billions to support Ukraine. So why was this wording an acceptable compromise, in your view?
I think the sense for this summit was from the United States and from the West as a whole that the G20 needed to hold together, and this needed to be a success for India, the hosts, at a juncture in which China, the Chinese leader, had decided not to show up, Xi Jinping. I think there was an expectation on the basis of all the other G20 meetings that had been taking place in preparation for this over the course of the year, that this language could kill the possibility of a joint agreement at the summit. And from China's perspective, I think they would have been happy to see all of this unravel. They would have been happy to see an outcome in which it was possible for the narrative to be the West and the developing world are in a sort of irretrievable rift. They can't agree basic positions on Russia and Ukraine. It's now going to be about the G20, the G7 and the BRICS. So I think the willingness on the part of the Europeans and the US to agree to language that they really didn't want. I mean, this is a walking back from the language that was agreed at Bali, that the Indians were very closely involved in getting fixed. I think it was disappointing, but seen as necessary, that it meant that India came out of this saying we were a successful host despite Xi Jinping's absence, and the West could be pragmatic about this. In the end, in the scheme of everything, it didn't matter so much to the war in Ukraine that you were able to get the same kind of language that you had at Bali, but it did matter that you didn't have a big split.
Indeed. And, okay, we kind of always knew that Putin was probably never going to show, but why else do you think President Xi didn't show up? Are you saying that this was, an effort by the Chinese to try and draw that parallel between US power in this part of the world?
Xi Jinping, a lot of this is about the bilateral relationship with India. I think it's quite clear that when we come to the next summit in Rio or the one afterwards in South Africa, I would expect the Chinese leader to show up. A lot of this reflects the tensions that have been over the border and concerns on the Chinese side about how this summit would play out for Xi Jinping. But I think there were kind of wider considerations as well. I think from Xi Jinping's perspective, it's not a great moment to be conducting some of these meetings. The Chinese economy is in a weak condition right now. I think there was a little bit of a concern about trying to avoid meetings with President Biden, with some other Western leaders that could put Xi Jinping under pressure, particularly on the Ukraine issue. But I think there was also a certain sense of maybe it was better to delegitimize the G20 as a forum. Maybe it was better to create framework in the world that said that the developing world and the G7 were coming apart. And I think if that was the tactic, the results that we've seen, not just on the language, but on a whole series of the other agreements that were reached at the forum, I think it's quite clear that this has failed. It's meant that China got written out of a lot of the big parts of the story this time. And so I think insofar as it was a tactic to try and create that narrative, it's not a tactic that worked.